The person who reads the least thinks they understand the most. And here's what makes that dangerous. They're not lying to you. They genuinely believe it. They walk through conversations, through entire lives, with a quiet certainty that they've figured out what other people haven't. They don't study. They don't question themselves. They don't sit with the discomfort of not knowing. They simply conclude, automatically, effortlessly, and completely without basis, that they are among the sharp ones. And the terrifying part? They're everywhere. They run companies. They raise children. They vote. They give you advice with the confidence of someone who has spent years thinking carefully, when in reality, they've spent years thinking the same thought over and over, wearing a groove in their mind and calling it wisdom. You've met them. You've probably had to smile at them, Dot. And if you're honest, truly honest, there's a part of you that has wondered whether you might be one of them without knowing it. That question is the beginning of intelligence. The fact that they never ask it. That's the whole problem. Asterisk. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being around people who are confidently wrong, Dot. It's not just frustration. It's something deeper. It's the feeling of being trapped in a room where the walls are made of someone else's assumptions, and no matter how carefully you explain, how precisely you articulate, how patiently you build your case, they look at you with a slight tilt of the head and say something that tells you they didn't hear a single word, not because they couldn't, because they didn't need to. They already knew. That's the thing about a certain kind of ignorance. It doesn't feel like ignorance from the inside. It feels like clarity. It feels like common sense. It feels, if anything, like the rest of the world is the confused one, and they are simply the ones sane enough to see through the noise, Dot. So you've learned to go quiet. You've learned to nod in the right places. You've learned that explaining yourself to someone who isn't curious is like pouring water into a sealed jar. It just runs down the outside and disappears, Dot. And maybe, somewhere in that silence, you've started to wonder if there's something wrong with you. If caring this much about truth and nuance is some kind of flaw. If the people who never doubt themselves have found a kind of peace you'll never access. Let me tell you something clearly. That peace is not wisdom. It's armor. Asterisk. This isn't random. It isn't just bad luck that some people seem constitutionally incapable of accurate self-assessment. There is a mechanism behind it, a psychological structure. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The people who understand the least are almost always the ones who feel most certain. And the people who understand the most are almost always the ones who feel most uncertain. This is not a coincidence. This is not a paradox. This is one of the most consistent and most quietly devastating patterns in all of human psychology. And it runs underneath everything, Dot. It runs underneath every bad leader who never listened. Every relationship that collapsed because one person refused to examine their own role in it. Every organization that failed because the people in charge were too confident to question their assumptions. Every conversation you've walked away from feeling invisible. The pattern has a name. It has a structure. And it has consequences that most people spend their entire lives experiencing without ever understanding what they're actually dealing with. In 1999, two psychologists named David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger ran a series of studies that revealed something that most perceptive people had already felt. but no one had formally documented. They found that people who performed the worst on tests of logic, grammar, and humor, specifically those in the bottom quartile, consistently and dramatically overestimated their own performance. Not a little. By a staggering margin. The least competent people didn't just fail. They failed and then told themselves they'd succeeded. And here's the detail that cuts the deepest. The skills you need to recognize a good performance are almost identical to the skills you need to produce a good performance. So if you lack the ability to think clearly, you also necessarily lack the ability to recognize that you're thinking unclearly. A gap doesn't show up on the inside dot. It's invisible from the inside dot. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. You've heard the name, but most people treat it like a personality quirk, a minor glitch in some people's software. They misunderstand how deep it goes, how early it starts, and what it actually does to the people it affects and the people around them. Because this isn't just about being wrong about a test. This is about being architecturally blocked from growth. And that has consequences that ripple outward for decades. Arthur Schopenhauer was not a kind man. He didn't write to comfort people. He wrote to tell the truth as he saw it, and he saw it in a way that most of his contemporaries found deeply unpleasant. He spent his life watching human beings deceive themselves, watching them construct elaborate justifications for their mediocrity, their cruelty, their smallness, and he documented it with a kind of cold precision that makes you feel both seen and slightly devastated. Schopenhauer believed that the human will, the blind, irrational, insatiable drive that sits at the core of every person, is fundamentally not interested in truth. It is interested in survival, in preservation, in making itself feel justified. The intellect, in Schopenhauer's framework, was supposed to be the tool of the will, a lantern to help us navigate reality. But what he observed, and what he wrote about with increasing exasperation, is that the will almost always succeeds in corrupting the lantern, in making the light bend toward what it wants to see rather than what is actually there. He called this the intellectual dishonesty that operates not on the surface of consciousness, but beneath it. People aren't lying to you in most cases. They are lying to themselves at a level they cannot access. The will has already arranged the furniture before the conscious mind enters the room. Schopenhauer saw something even darker underneath the dot. He believed that most people are not actually engaged in thinking. They are engaged in the performance of thinking. They use the language of reasoning, the posture of analysis, the vocabulary of reflection, but the conclusion was settled before the process began. The mind moves backward from the desired outcome to the justifying premises, and it does this so smoothly, so quickly, so automatically, that the person genuinely experiences it as original thought. He called this egoism of the intellect, the tendency to subordinate reality to the needs of the self. And the less developed the intellect, the more total that subordination becomes. Here is where it gets darker, because the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't static. It isn't a ceiling you hit and stay at. It is, in its most entrenched form, self-reinforcing. And Schopenhauer would have understood exactly why. When a person lacks the metacognitive ability to assess their own understanding accurately, they also lack the mechanism that would motivate them to improve. Because why would you seek out new information if you already feel informed? Why would you question your instincts if your instincts feel reliable? Why would you do the difficult, uncomfortable work of expanding your knowledge when you already experience yourself as knowledgeable? The ignorance isn't just a gap in their understanding. It's a gap that closes the door to filling itself. And then the feedback loops begin, because confident people get rewarded, not always with truth, but with social currency, with authority, with the deference of people around them who mistake certainty for accuracy. And every time that happens, every time the confident incompetent is treated as if they are correct, the belief calcifies a little more. They stop being someone who hasn't learned yet. They become someone who doesn't believe learning is necessary. That is a very different thing, and it happens gradually, invisibly, over years of accumulated social reinforcement, until what started as a simple gap in knowledge has become a complete and total foreclosure of the possibility of doubt. Let's break down the mechanics of how this actually operates. Not in abstract terms, in the specific psychological, behaviorally precise way that Schopenhauer would recognize, and that you, if you look carefully, will recognize in people you know. The first mechanism, premature closure. The incompetent mind doesn't sit with ambiguity. It resolves it immediately, automatically, and usually incorrectly. Where a more calibrated mind would hold a question open, continuing to gather information and resist conclusion, the overconfident mind snaps the question shut. Done. Understood. Next, this isn't laziness in the traditional sense. It's an architectural feature, a cognitive style that prioritizes the comfort of resolution over the accuracy of the answer. The second mechanism, attribution inversion. When something goes wrong for a person in the grip of this pattern, the failure is almost never located inside themselves. It's the system, the people around them, the unfairness of the situation, the fact that others couldn't see what they were seeing. Their success, by contrast, is almost always personally attributed. The asymmetry is total, and it is constant. And it's nearly impossible to challenge, because any challenge is itself reframed as further evidence of the other person's failure to understand. The third mechanism, social camouflage. This is the one that makes it so difficult to detect from the outside. Confident, fluent speech patterns. Strong opinions delivered without visible hesitation. The ability to fill a silence without appearing to struggle. These are behaviors that read socially as competence. They generate trust. They attract followers. And because intelligence, actual intelligence, is often quieter, more measured, more likely to caveat, more likely to say, "I'm not sure," it can read, in contrast, as weakness. The room gravitates to the person who sounds certain, not the person who is right. The fourth mechanism, selective exposure. People in this pattern do not consume information that challenges their existing worldview. This is not always a deliberate choice. It is, more often, a felt sense of irrelevance. Things that contradict what they already believe simply don't register as interesting. Their information diet narrows over time, not through active rejection, but through passive disinterest. And as it narrows, the walls close in. The world shrinks to the size of what they already know. And everything inside those walls gets interpreted as confirmation that the walls don't need to move. The fifth mechanism, immunity to feedback. Feedback. Real, honest, specific feedback about performance or understanding is the primary mechanism through which competence actually develops. But it only works if the person receiving it can hold the possibility that it's accurate. For someone operating with severe overconfidence, feedback doesn't land as information. It lands as an attack, or as evidence of the other person's misunderstanding, or as irrelevant, coming from someone clearly less qualified. The immune response triggers before the content can be processed, and so the feedback bounces off every time, and the gap stays exactly where it is. The sixth mechanism, the confidence cascade. Once you are perceived as confident in one domain, once people around, you have begun to treat you as an authority. That perceived authority begins to generalize. People assume that someone who sounds certain about business must have valid opinions about psychology. That someone who is forceful about politics must understand history. The person themselves begins to believe it. The confidence metastasizes across domains they've never seriously studied, carrying with it the full social weight of the domains where it was first established. They become experts in everything, which is to say, experts in nothing. What does this pattern actually do to a person's life? Not the hypothetical version. The real one. It does this. It traps them at the level of understanding they reached the moment they stopped feeling curious. It freezes them in the intellectual snapshot of whatever age they last felt genuinely uncertain. And because they don't experience this as stagnation, because it feels from the inside like stability, like confidence, like having figured things out, they have no idea it's happening. They stop growing and they call it maturity. They stop learning and they call it experience. They stop questioning and they call it conviction, and the people around them pay for it. Their partners who cannot reach them. Their children who are raised inside the architecture of unexamined certainty. Their colleagues who have to watch mediocre decisions be made with complete confidence. Their employees who have to execute on strategies that anyone with an hour of honest reflection would have abandoned. The Dunning-Kruger effect, in its fully developed form, is not just a personal limitation. It radiates outward. It shapes rooms. It shapes organizations. It shapes cultures. And the tragedy, the real tragedy that Schopenhauer would recognize immediately, is that the people most harmed by it are also the ones least equipped to protect themselves from it, because they can't see what they're in proximity to. The overconfident move through the world, generating consequences they will never attribute to themselves. And the people with genuine understanding watch it happen, name it quietly to themselves, and have nowhere to direct that recognition except inward. Asterisk. Here's what I want you to sit with. The discomfort you feel, the uncertainty, the constant internal questioning, the inability to settle into easy answers is not a malfunction. It is not a symptom of inadequacy. It is the sign that your metacognition is functioning, that your ability to assess your own understanding hasn't been captured by your ego. The people who never doubt themselves are not stronger than you. They are less equipped than you. They have simply found a way, unconsciously, systemically, through years of psychological reinforcement, to not feel the friction that growth requires. You feel that friction. That is the beginning of actual understanding. Schopenhauer believed that the intellect, capable of genuine insight, was, by necessity, the intellect willing to oppose the will, willing to look at reality, without requiring reality to confirm what the will needs to believe. That kind of honesty is rare, not because most people are dishonest, but because the system that produces self-deception is ancient and powerful, and operates below the level of intention. To fight, it requires something most people never develop: the tolerance for being uncertain and continuing anyway. The ability to hold the question open, even when every instinct screams for resolution. The willingness to say, "I might be wrong," not as a social performance, but as a genuine epistemological position. That tolerance is not weakness. That tolerance is the most intellectually demanding thing a human being can practice. Asterisk. So let's end where Schopenhauer ended, not with comfort, but with clarity. Most people will not grow past the point where certainty became more comfortable than truth. Most people will spend their lives inside an understanding they built in their 20s and defend it until they die. Most people will meet genuine insight and experience it as an attack, because insight threatens the architecture that holds the self together. You can't fix that from the outside. You cannot educate your way past someone's immunity to education. You cannot reason with someone who has defined your reasoning as evidence of your confusion. What you can do, what you must do, if the pattern of this video resonates at all, is refuse to let proximity to that kind of certainty make you doubt your own calibration. The fact that you think carefully does not make you slow. The fact that you question yourself does not make you weak. The fact that you can hold complexity without collapsing it into a simple answer does not make you uncertain. It makes you honest. In a world that rewards confidence and punishes nuance, real intelligence will often look like hesitation. Real wisdom will often look like silence. And the people who actually understand the most will often be mistaken by the loudest people in the room for the ones who understand the least. Schopenhauer knew this. He lived it. And he wrote it down so that the ones paying attention would know they weren't alone in seeing it. You are not confused. You are just awake in a room full of people who are very comfortable dreaming.